Hare Krishna. So this is the Bhagavad Gita part 6 today. We're going to cover as much as chapter 3 as we can. I don't think we can reach the end of it, but we're going to do as much as we can. And so the chapter is called Karma Yoga, and we'll start with a little bit of a review of last time, just to kind of make sure where we are. The chapter 2 is a summary of things that will come later, especially this and the next several chapters, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Summarizes those contents, but in a very not a completely systematic way, and kind of it's a summary, so it's not in detail. So in chapter 2, we started out when Krishna began his instructions with Sankhya Yoga, or discussing the nature of the soul. And he had seized upon that as the particular error that Arjuna was making. Arjuna had all these different arguments why he shouldn't fight, and Krishna touched on that point, that this is where you're making your mistake. You don't understand the soul, and that's why you're allowing your emotions to carry you away, and allowing yourself to come up with all these kind of fallacious arguments why you shouldn't fight. And then, but because it's not so easy to understand the soul in a practical way, just by hearing it. We mentioned that, the verse, the amazing verse, that even people who hear about it, and it's rare even to hear about it, can't understand it. So in order to help one to come to the stage of, Prabhupada says, practical realization, where we can really experience ourselves as souls. We looked at, the various qualities there, that, we can't be cut to pieces by any weapon, or burned by fire, moistened by water, so many other things. We're changeless, and so many things, and we don't feel that way as human beings, because we don't realize ourselves experience ourselves as souls. We're caught up in our attention is captured by the externals, the mind and the body and the objects of the senses. And we're absorbed in that, and so we can't experience ourselves as souls. So Krishna gives the path of Buddhi Yoga or Karma Yoga, where he tells Arjuna, follow your dharma, don't abandon it. It's actually a great thing that Arjuna was very renounced. He wasn't greedy for the kingdom. He wasn't greedy for the results. He said, I wouldn't even fight if I could get all the 3 worlds, what to speak of a kingdom. So he said, that's very good. You can apply that along with your knowledge of the soul. Because once you understand that you're a soul, you're going to have a different aim in life. He says your ultimate aim can't be anything material. It doesn't make any sense. So he said, you bring that knowledge of the soul into your performing your dharma. So you follow your dharma without a desire for material gain. That's a karma yoga, or nishkama karma yoga without desires. And with that, then he followed along to jnana yoga. Prabhupada gives this yoga ladder in his purport in chapter 6. That when karma yoga, is filled with knowledge, we talked about it at the end. The praga pratishtita is filled with great knowledge. Then you begin to have realization of the soul. Then it's called jnana yoga. And then we also heard at the end that in order for karma yoga to successfully mature into jnana yoga, the practitioner must fix his consciousness on Krishna and experience the higher tastes. As bhakti yoga is a required element. So bhakti yoga is the ultimate goal of the yoga ladder, but it has to be incorporated to some degree even in the early stages for the yoga ladder to work. So we're going to find out in Bhagavad Gita that every other path requires some bhakti, but bhakti is completely independent and can be taken up by anyone at any time. So the conclusion, when we understand this, ourselves as a soul, we conclude that nothing material can be one's ultimate goal, that we should seek transcendence. We have no place in this material world. It's not us. And when we bring the theoretical knowledge of the soul and the desire for transcendence into one's actions, one follows one's dharma but does not seek the material rewards of dharma. Such action helps one to overcome attachment and aversion. This is a ongoing theme in Bhagavad Gita, that Arjuna's aversion to killing his relatives and having all these terrible things happen forced him to want to not to follow his duty. Whereas on the other side, Dhritarashtra and Duryodhana, their attachment, their desire for the kingdom, caused them to transgress the laws of Dharma. So it says that so when one follows one's Dharma, automatically that helps you to break attachment and aversion. You may end up having to do things you don't want to, like Arjuna is about to do, or you may not be able to do things you want to, as happens with would have happened with Duryodhana and Dhritarashtra. When one practically experiences oneself as a soul, and this is when karma yoga becomes mature, one is no longer disturbed by material miseries or attracted to material enjoyment. One becomes free from all material desires and is able to withdraw the senses from their objects like a tortoise, and to act with the senses without being affected by attraction and aversion. This was the last section we covered last week. Somebody who's a pragya pratishtha, someone who's filled with high levels of knowledge, profound knowledge, and is fixed in that. So for them, the karma yoga is reaping benefits, and they're beginning to experience themselves as a soul. So that therefore, we don't pay attention to the material miseries or are attracted by material happiness. It's hard for us to understand that when we're not on that level, because these things are very prominent to us. But when we realize that these sensations are really separate from us, we don't pay them as much mind. We don't pay as much attention to them. And then there's no material desires, because there's happiness in understanding oneself to be a soul. There's a self-satisfaction there. So in that way, because we're not satisfied, we're always engaging the senses trying to find some happiness. Because then they can withdraw them. And when they don't withdraw them, they act without attachment and aversion, because they're not concerned so much with what happens. They're already happy. So they can act very dutifully and not be worried, I don't want this, or I desire this. So they act on a totally different platform. And then with regards to bhakti, because what happens, in Bhagavad Gita is we said that the second through sixth chapters are a description of this yoga ladder. Prabhupada mentions this. There's these different types of yogas are mentioned that lead toward bhakti. We also discussed that the yoga ladder isn't practical in this day and age, and so what Prabhupada does, and also what we will do once we become bhaktas, and is that we will see the verses of these chapters in kind of a bhakti light, to see how they actually also apply. Because we quoted where Prabhupada said that these different yogas remain components of bhakti, so we can see them in a bhakti light, and that's how Prabhupada comments and translates the Bhagavad Gita as it is. He comes from that side. We want to discuss also the yoga ladder, because we want to see analyze our own bhakti to see if these particular components actually are present in our bhakti, and see what's supposed to be happening from our bhakti. So we're going to simultaneously explain it from the yoga ladder part, but the bhakti interpretation actually will end up being more dear to our hearts. So if we try to apply it to bhakti, if we understand ourselves as a soul and aim for transcendence, then we will practice bhakti without a desire for material gain, just like the person follows their Vedic Dharma. For us, we're following the Sanatan Dharma, our eternal Dharma, our constitutional Dharma of being a servant of Krishna. The various Vedic Dharmas really just aren't there. We don't have the Varnashram structure in society. It just isn't available to us. So the notion of this karma yoga, there's really no way to do it in this day and age. So for us, we take up our eternal dharma, our Sanatana Dharma as a servant of Krishna, and we do it with that same attitude, not desiring some particular result. That's the bhakti take on that. That's how the karma yoga becomes incorporated into bhakti. And the bhakti produces the same effects as karma yoga. It begins to allow us to experience the soul, but there's more to it. We also get the higher taste at a much earlier stage. People describe how the first time they chanted Hare Krishna, the first time they tasted prasadam, first time they came to the temple, saw the deities and things. People, even in a very beginning state, feel something very powerful, because we in bhakti we come into direct contact with Krishna very early. In karma yoga, you're working, doing your duties, trying to do it without attachment, and it isn't necessarily very tasteful, because it takes time then for one to become less absorbed in the externals and to come to the point of realizing, having experience of the soul, or beyond that, the super soul. So and also bhakti attracts Krishna's help on the path. And so Krishna is also helping us move forward. Where with the Nishkama Karma Yoga, you're more or less on your own. So with progress on the path, with progress on the path, the characteristics of Jnana Yoga increasingly appear. That's also for us, along with a deepening connection with and remembrance of Krishna. So it says in Srimad Bhagavatam that knowledge, jnana, and vairagya, they come up as byproducts of bhakti. And of course, we also then will have a deepening connection and remembrance of Krishna, because we're serving him right from the beginning. And the bhakti analog of the jnani's withdrawal of the senses, like the tortoise or the turtle, is the bhakta's increasingly focused and attentive japa. So Prabhupada also kind of compares the two here in the beginning of chapter 3, that simply stopping all activities like the jnanis may do is analogous to our sitting in one place and chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra. So in one way we can, I think, take a good temperature reading of our advancement in devotional service is to see how attentive and focused our japa is. We get a chance to do that every day, take the temperature here. If we have a greater understanding of ourselves as soul, and of course a greater realization of Krishna, then all these things, our mind is going to be much more peaceful, our body is going to be much more peaceful, we're going to be much more able to focus on the holy name. So when we sit down and chant and find ourselves restless and the mind wandering, then we can see that, well, we've got some ways to go. Okay, so we're going to start with a kind of a section of verses 1 through 8, where Arjuna thinks he sees a way out of fighting. He thinks he has a loophole. But Krishna kind of disabuses him of that notion. He explains otherwise. Arjuna thinks now he has, he offered all these philosophical arguments at the beginning, and now after hearing from Krishna, he thinks, hey, I've got a new way to do it that will be legitimate now, because I'm simply using Krishna's instructions. So the first two verses is where Arjuna expresses that. He says, Arjuna said, this is 3:1, O Janardhan, O Keshava, why do you want to engage me in this ghastly warfare if you think that intelligence is better than fruitive work? And in 3:2 he says, my intelligence is bewildered by your equivocal instructions. Therefore, please tell me decisively which will be most beneficial for me. And so Prabhupada says in his purport, he says, sometimes Krishna consciousness is misunderstood to be inertia, and one with such a misunderstanding often withdraws to a secluded place to become fully Krishna conscious by chanting the holy name of Lord Krishna. Arjuna also thought of Krishna consciousness or Buddhi Yoga, or intelligence in spiritual advancement of knowledge as something like retirement from active life and the practice of penance and austerity at a secluded place. In other words, he wanted to skillfully avoid the fighting by using Krishna consciousness as an excuse. So we in text 249, Arjuna heard that he should avoid all abominable activity, avaram karma. And then he also heard in 258 how one who is fixed in profound knowledge, pragya pratishtita, withdraws his senses like the tortoise. So now he thinks he may have a true spiritual basis for indulging his aversion in participating in the battles. This is why, if I'm not supposed to do anything horrible, in that verse it really means anything that's done with material desire is horrible, abominable. But he just, he hears that it's he thinks fighting is going to be horrible, the destruction that's going to be caused. So he equivocates there. And when he hears how the person of great knowledge just simply withdraws his senses, and why should he engage his senses in something that seems so devastating? So now he thinks, okay, now he has an opportunity. His previous arguments didn't work. Now he's onto something, and he can avoid it. But then Krishna responds to him and tells him that he's not ready for that. Basically, in 3:3, it says, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "O sinless Arjuna, I have already explained that there are two classes of men who try to realize the self. Some are inclined to understand it by empirical, philosophical speculation, and others by devotional services, so Sankhya and Buddhi, or Karma Yoga." So, and so he says, not merely by abstaining from work, this is 3:4, not by merely abstaining from work can one achieve freedom from reaction, nor by renunciation alone can one attain perfection. 3:5 is everyone is forced to act helplessly according to the qualities he has acquired from the modes of material nature. Therefore, no one can refrain from doing something, not even for a moment. And then 3:6 he says, one who restrains the senses of action, but whose mind dwells on sense objects, certainly deludes himself and is called a pretender. And so Prabhupada says in his purport to 3:4, says the renounced order of life can be accepted when one has been purified by the discharge of the prescribed form of duties which are laid down just to purify the hearts of materialistic men. Without purification, one cannot attain success by abruptly adopting the fourth order of life, or sannyas. And then Krishna goes on and says, in 3:7 and 3:8, on the other hand, if a sincere person tries to control the active senses by the mind and begins karma yoga in Krishna consciousness without attachment, he is by far superior. And 3:8, perform your prescribed duty, for doing so is better than not working. One cannot even maintain one's physical body without work. And Prabhupada says in the purport to 3:8, Lord Krishna did not want Arjuna to become a pretender. Rather, the Lord desired that Arjuna perform his prescribed duties as set forth for Kshatriyas. Arjuna was a householder and a military general, and therefore it was better for him to remain as such and perform his religious duties as prescribed for the householder Kshatriya. Such activities gradually cleanse the heart of a mundane man and free him from material contamination. So the upshot is that karma yoga provides the purification necessary to be qualified for that jnana yoga, to be a pragya pratishtha, to have that profound, not be situated in profound knowledge. So Arjuna is trying to do this prematurely, is what Krishna is saying. That's shown by his continued aversion to participating in the battle. It mentioned that somebody, and the last time, somebody who acts, who has that profound knowledge of pragya pratishtha, that they act without attachment and aversion. So Arjuna is still showing symptoms of that. So he's not purified enough, apparently, to take up the stopping of the senses, to being deeply into jnana yoga. So without sufficient purification, one will generally not be able to control the senses. Krishna said no one can act stop acting even for a moment because they're pushed by the modes of material nature. And so even if they do, in the next verse, he said their mind will dwell on sense objects. So you have to be able to control both the body, and most people can't do that. The senses will work, and even if you can somehow stop the senses, then the mind is going to work. So it takes a real realization of the soul, a real experience of the soul, to follow the Dharma that was kind of described at the end of chapter 2, where somebody can withdraw the senses from their objects. Okay, so he's telling Arjuna, this is premature. If you try it, you're going to fail. So he says, no, better you understand your position and continue with the karma yoga. Do what you're supposed to do without attachment. Then Prabhupada makes a couple of interesting points in his purports that are a little bit off the kind of the direct line of what we're talking about, but I think they're really interesting. And so in the purport to 3.5, he said, it is not a question of embodied life, but it is the nature of the soul to be always active. Without the presence of the spirit soul, the material body cannot move. The body is only a dead vehicle to be worked by the spirit soul, which is always active and cannot stop, even for a moment. Because we're going to see later on in the chapter that Krishna is going to, first he tells Arjuna that, somebody who's not qualified with that profound knowledge can't give up doing their duties without attachment, that will harm them. They need to develop the qualification through that karma yoga, become purified. Without the actual realization of the soul, they're helpless against the modes of material nature and against their mind and senses. And actually they'll end up doing sinful things, actually. So it'll be a disaster for them to do that. But later on, Krishna says, even somebody who has that qualification, there are good reasons for them to continue to act without attachment. And he gives certain reasons here in chapter 3 to be an example for others. So he gives those reasons, but there's has to be an underlying thing, because Krishna is coming to teach everybody about bhakti. Once we reach chapter 7 and chapter 7 through 12, we're going to hear exclusively about bhakti, and that's what really Krishna is trying to teach us. And so in bhakti, we already heard when we studied the Nectar of Instruction how bhakti is a cultivation. He says it's active. Prabhupada mentions that several times, and we even see, if you look at the Krishna's devotees in the spiritual world, what are they doing? They're not sitting around and meditating. They're active. The cowherd boys are playing with Krishna. So it's actually natural here, he says, for the soul to be active. So Krishna, by always encouraging action, in another way, is preparing us for bhakti. Even in the super advanced stages of bhakti, people may seem not to be so active. Some of the people who are, in Leela Smarana, remember in the but they're acting in their spiritual bodies. There's always activity. And then Prabhupada says the indirect process is philosophical speculation. This is from 3.5 also, by which gradually one may come to the point of Krishna consciousness. And the other process is directly connecting everything with Krishna in Krishna consciousness. Of these two, the path of Krishna consciousness is better because it does not depend on purifying the senses by a philosophical process. Krishna consciousness is itself the purifying process, and by the direct method of devotional service, it is simultaneously easy and sublime. So here, according to the yoga ladder, we're transitioning from karma yoga to jnana yoga. And here, Prabhupada is mentioning, of course, what happens, of course, on the yoga ladder is the jnana yoga moves into bhakti yoga, if things work out as they should. So here he's saying that Krishna consciousness actually works better, or bhakti can work better, even though it's the highest thing. It actually works better than jnana does at creating purification. So Jnana says we're going from karma yoga to jnana yoga to bhakti yoga. But he says without the karma yoga, the jnana yoga is very difficult, because he says it depends upon purifying the senses by a philosophical process. And Krishna consciousness, bhakti, not only, of course, reveals the nature of the soul, but the soul's connection with Krishna. It goes further. The jnanis can understand the Atma, the soul, but they can't understand the soul's deep identity. So even though bhakti is a more advanced process, it produces its own qualification. He says it says that Krishna consciousness itself is purifying. So this is another indication of how bhakti is independent of the other processes. That it takes something else to reach jnana, and then jnana hopefully will go into bhakti. But you can practice bhakti at a pre-jnana stage, and the jnana will come out as a component, a byproduct of bhakti. It's interesting. Okay, so the next section of verses we'll take a look at is verses 9 through 16, where it talks about sacrifice, yajna. And again, it expresses the necessity of having some bhakti within this process of the yoga ladder. And and Krishna shows what that is. He shows how they can be, because in the last chapter 2, we just talked about they have to have some experience of the Supreme, param drishtva, experience of the Supreme, either the super soul, or in bhakti we get some experience of Krishna's presence right away. And he said we had to be connected with him, yukta. We had to become matparaha. We had to fix our consciousness on him. The jnanis would fix their consciousness on him while they're, performing their activities. Those with profound knowledge, and otherwise they wouldn't be able to succeed. They wouldn't be able to maintain. We talked about how easily the senses pull the mind away, how the mind pulls the intelligence away, how so easily it's possible to be pulled out of that position of profound knowledge. So the bhakti is required to bring some stability to that. And so here we're going to hear a little bit more about how bhakti can be integrated into this yoga ladder. So in text 3.9, Yashnartat karma no nyatra lokoyam karma bandhanaha tadartam karma kaunteya mukta sangha samachara. Work done as a sacrifice for Vishnu has to be performed. Otherwise, work causes bondage in this material world. Therefore, O son of Kunti, perform your prescribed duties for his satisfaction, and in that way you will always remain free from bondage. So he's trying to be, that's his idea. Krishna told him from the beginning, he's supposed to aim at transcendence. So this expands upon that notion that bhakti is required in order for karma yoga and jnana yoga to be successful, and gives some guidelines for that. The word here is yajna artat, done only for the sake of yajna or Vishnu, because the yajna means sacrifice, but it's also the proper name. There's the Yuga avatar, yajna, who teaches the sacrifice, and is part of the Yajna Purush. So it says so things done for the sake, artat, for the satisfaction of yajna. And it says here also mukta sangha. So Prabhupada says liberated from association, and some of the other commentators say that means free from attachment. Just like we were talking about, that the persons performing karma yoga or us performing bhakti yoga are trying to do it without an attachment for the results. And so the same thing, he's telling, Krishna's advising that we do something for the sake of the Lord, or do something for sacrifice. It really means the same thing. That's what sacrifice means. Prabhupada will talk about that there's the yajnapati is always worshipped, and that we should do it without wanting the result. And so this is his advice to Arjuna. Because there are various sacrifices and things that are prescribed for those in the Vedic system. And Prabhupada says in his purport to 3.9, the Vedas enjoin yajno vai Vishnu. In other words, the same purpose is served whether one performs prescribed yajnas or directly serves Lord Vishnu. Krishna consciousness is therefore performance of yajna as it is prescribed in this verse. So Prabhupada also, he gives us, he's going to give us the bhakti take on these verses, because, and he says, and Prabhupada says, nothing should be performed for sense gratification, but everything should be done for the satisfaction of Krishna. Because from the bhakti, or from the yoga ladder perspective, there's various types of sacrifices that are prescribed in the Vedas. When we take up bhakti, we focus directly on Krishna, and here Prabhupada says, that it's the same thing. If we simply directly serve the Lord, that takes care of all of those things. And as far as the mukta sangha, the notion of being free from association, he says everything should be done. Nothing should be done for sense gratification, but everything should be done for the satisfaction of Krishna. So that takes care of that part of it. If we're doing something for Krishna's pleasure instead of our own, that's going to fulfill that criterion. So then in the next verses, it's described a bit more. And the 3.10 through 3.13, we'll just read through those. In the beginning, this is 3.10, in the beginning of creation, the Lord of all creatures sent forth generations of men and demigods, along with sacrifices for Vishnu, and blessed them by saying, be thou happy with this yajna sacrifice, because its performance will bestow upon you everything desirable for living happily and achieving liberation. And 3.11, the demigods being pleased by sacrifices will also please you, and thus by cooperation between men and demigods, prosperity will reign for all. And 3.12 is in charge of the various necessities of life. The demigods being satisfied by the performance of yajna sacrifice will supply all necessities to you. But he who enjoys such gifts without offering them to the demigods in return is certainly a thief. And 3.13, the devotees of the Lord are released from all kinds of sins because they eat food which is offered first for sacrifice. Others who prepare food for personal sense enjoyment verily eat only sin. So those on the yoga ladder, they view the demigods as limbs of the Lord because they are acting in his service. This is from the commentary of Baladeva Dibhushan. Also, Prabhupada confirms that later on in one of his purports, although he's talking about how we should deal with how we should approach sacrifice in a Krishna conscious way there. So this is how even the worship of the demigods by the persons on the yoga ladder are integrated into the pleasure of the Lord. They see the demigods as his limbs or as his servants and doing his bidding. They don't see them as independent. Right. And then some of the yajnas are meant to satisfy particular demigods, but even in so doing, Lord Vishnu is worshipped in all yajnas as the chief beneficiary. That's from Prabhupada's purport in 3.11. So there's the Lord is the Yajnapati. And so he's always worshipped in all of those sacrifices. And then as far as the offering of food, in bhakti, we offer all of our food and take prasadam. And whereas for the people on the yoga ladder, there's certain sacrifices prescribed. Prabhupada says there's the 5, pancha yajnas that are prescribed. One of them is they offer a small quantity of food at noon. This is from Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur to various demigods and to Agni. I guess there's fire there. It's a bit of a fire sacrifice too. And so it says that's what they do, and they take those remnants. That's their prasadam. They don't offer everything to the Lord as we do. So we have a little advantage as bhaktas, always taking prasadam. And so in bhakti, the way that the sacrifice works is that this is from Prabhupada's Purport of 314. When Lord Krishna is worshipped, the demigods, who are different limbs of the Lord, are also automatically worshipped. As for he confirms that they're the limbs of the Lord. Therefore, there is no separate need to worship the demigods. So that's why we notice in bhakti we're not performing sacrifices generally. And Prabhupada says in 312 in his purport, Lord Chaitanya, however, inaugurated the easiest performance of yajna, namely the Sankirtan yajna, which can be performed by anyone in the world who accepts the principles of Krishna consciousness. So that's our sacrifice, the chanting of the holy names. And then Prabhupada says in the 313 in his purport, the santas, the devotees, being always in a compact of love with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, cannot accept anything without first offering it to the Supreme Person. Therefore, such devotees always perform yajnas in different modes of devotional service, such as shravanam, kirtanam, smaranam, archanam, etc. So this confirms what he said earlier, that service offered directly to the Lord that qualifies as a sacrifice. So many of the Vedic sacrifice prescribed for people, the bhaktas don't follow, because they're already, basically almost their whole lives are meant to be a sacrifice. If we're constantly engaged in devotional service, that means our whole existence is sacrifice. And chanting the holy names, but also just hearing and chanting, remembering and worshiping the deity, and the other of the 9 processes of devotional service count as sacrifices. So it's not something we in the yoga ladder. It's something that they kind of add on to their life. There are certain duties that they have to do. For hardcore bhaktas, it becomes their whole life. So those in the yoga ladder incorporate some bhakti into their practice. And that's what they're trying to do here. They perform some sacrifice for the pleasure of the Lord. So they fix their mind on Him in the execution of their duties, their consciousness on Him. They try to experience, His presence as the super soul in particular. That's what those who are in jnana can do. It says when one realizes the soul, realizes themselves as soul, can experience that, then it's quite natural to have some perception of the super soul, because they're right there. It says they're like 2 birds in a tree. Right now we're so distracted by monitoring the mind and the senses and the rest of the world around us, mind and body and the world around us, that we don't even recognize ourselves. We talked about that power of abhiveshanata, that absorption, that it takes all of our attention away, so we don't even recognize ourselves. And so therefore we can't recognize who's right there with us. So they incorporate some bhakti into their practice, but the idea, of course, ultimately is that they'll take up bhakti exclusively, and that's Krishna is going to lead us to that point. So for them, there's some bhakti in it, but the predominating part is either karma yoga or jnana yoga. Later on, there'll be ashtanga yoga that we hear about in chapter 6. So they have predominantly the proportion of bhakti is not so great, and the desire to directly serve the Lord is not so much there. But it has to have some of that in order for them to succeed. And now in verses 17 through 29, Krishna explains that even purified persons, he told Arjuna that he wasn't qualified, and people who aren't qualified with the really experiential knowledge of the soul shouldn't try to give up their varnashram duties, their duties according to dharma, because they simply don't have the purification required. They'll simply fall victim to push themselves back under the control of the mind and senses. That's what's really going to happen, and actually they'll end up performing sinful activities. So it'll be really a disaster for them. So Krishna is going to give an argument here, but how even such persons who have the qualifications for it, they have they have this profound knowledge that was described in the last chapter. They have this experiential situation where they can perceive the soul themselves, experience themselves as souls. That they even also should continue to follow their dharma, shouldn't give up their performing their Vedic dharmic duties. So he's going to give an argument for that here. And so at the beginning of the chapter, Krishna discourages Arjuna from abandoning karma yoga prematurely in order to avoid the pitfalls of taking up jnana yoga without sufficient qualification. And now Krishna will argue that there are good reasons for even qualified jnana yogis to continue to follow dharmic duties. So note that while chapter 2 mentioned how those with profound knowledge are able to withdraw the senses from their objects, they also are described as acting with the senses without attachment and aversion. One of the questions Arjuna asked was, how do these people walk? It means, how do they act? And so that was the answer. It says that they sometimes engage their senses, but they do it without attachment and aversion. So there's nothing that prevents them from engaging their senses at all. They also tend to do that. And so then Krishna says he talks about such people here in text 317. Yastvatmarati syad atmatriptascha manavaha atmanyeva cha santushtas tasya karyam na vidyate. But for one who takes pleasure in the self, this is atmarati, whose human life is one of self-realization, and who is satisfied in the self only, atmatripta, fully satiated, santushta, for him there is no duty. As the performance of the duties without attachment was supposed to lead to that platform. So for Arjuna, who Krishna thought was not ready for that, he thought that trying to withdraw the senses from their objects would be premature. But for somebody who already is there, they're atmarati, they're taking pleasure in the self, atmatripta, self-illuminated and satisfied, and santushta, perfectly satiated. So that they've already reached the goal of that practice. Okay? And Prabhupada says in his purport, is really a powerful purport. Here he's talking though about specifically about bhakti, because like I said, we as bhaktas we'll look for the bhakti meaning in these verses more than the yoga ladder. But the yoga ladder understanding will help us to analyze our bhakti. So Prabhupada says, a person who is fully, it's in italics, Krishna conscious, and is fully satisfied by his acts in Krishna consciousness, no longer has any duty to perform. Due to his being Krishna conscious, all impiety within is instantly cleansed, an effect of many, many thousands of yajna performances. By such clearing of consciousness, one becomes fully confident of his eternal position in relationship with the Supreme. His duty thus becomes self-illuminated by the grace of the Lord, and therefore he no longer has any obligations to the Vedic injunctions. Such a Krishna-conscious person is no longer interested in material activities and no longer takes pleasure in material arrangements like wine, women, and similar infatuations. So here we see that Prabhupada translates and comments from a bhakti perspective, because there's two places the word atma is given, atmarati and atma tripti. So was it? Yeah. And he translates that in the smooth translation as self with a capital S, which we know is the convention for referring either to the super soul or even to the Supreme Lord personally, not the soul. The soul is the small self with a small s, and so what he's talking about here in the purport, it looks to me like he's referring to what happens when one reaches the stage of spontaneous devotional service. We talked about that a little bit in the Nectar of Instruction, and we'll deal with it a lot more in the Nectar of Devotion. So that when that at first one's devotional service is directed and based upon, motivated by faith in the rules and regulations. We have a certain thing we have a certain procedure for cultivating bhakti, and we follow that procedure, follow that process. And the motivation is that we understand the value of it, and we want to, and we have confidence that by following that process, that we will advance in Krishna consciousness, and we can serve Krishna in that way. That this is the authorized path. As one develops in Krishna consciousness, there reaches a point at the stage of ruchi and asakti, where even though we're practicing devotional service, it becomes the desire to serve becomes less based on our understanding and intelligence and just based on our desire. So we could get this a very, very strong taste for Krishna consciousness that pushes away everything else. And a huge enthusiasm comes in. And in that case, that's what the basis is. It's based on our own internal desire to serve that isn't it's a little bit theoretical for us when we're practicing on the lower levels of bhakti. When we sometimes are not able to follow through. We want to be serving Krishna all the time, but we're distracted by various things. We can't remember Krishna all the time. Sometimes the desires come up, and sometimes we resist them, and sometimes we don't. And so that's, but by our intelligence, we're thinking, no, I want to serve Krishna. I want to follow this particular procedure. But later on, it says the taste for bhakti increases and increases. Then, as we have in the Shikshastakam, that you don't want anything, wealth or followers or women. None of these things seem attractive. You just want to serve. That seems what Prabhupada's talking about here in that purport. From a yoga ladder perspective, Atma here is like the small self, because Prabhupada has in the word for word translation, he has it as the small self. I think, or is it? No, I might be confusing that with another verse. But that's another verse. But from a yoga ladder perspective, the Atma here will just be talked about as the soul. So for somebody who's at that stage of profound knowledge, they will be satisfied in the soul, and in knowledge of the soul, and what is that? They'll be taking pleasure in the soul, and they'll be perfectly satisfied by their experience of the soul. Where with the bhakta, we're talking about connected with Krishna. Okay, so let's go on a little further, and we'll go through the rest of the verses in the section 318 through 321, where Krishna says that he gives a bit more of his argument here of why such a person should continue to act. And he says in 318, a self-realized man has no purpose to fulfill in the discharge of his prescribed duties, nor has he any reason not to perform such work, nor has he any need to depend on any other living being. In 319, therefore, without being attached to the fruits of activities, one should act as a matter of duty, for by working without attachment, one attains the supreme. And 320 is kings such as Janaka attained perfection solely by performance of prescribed duties. Therefore, just for the sake of educating the people in general, you should perform your work. And 321, whatever action a great man performs, common men follow, and whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. A famous verse. And then, and so Prabhupada says in his purport to 320, he says, kings like Janaka were all self-realized souls. Consequently, they had no obligation to perform the prescribed duties in the Vedas. Nonetheless, they performed all prescribed activities just to set examples for the people in general. So this is the thrust of Krishna's argument to Arjuna. So even if you are qualified, You still should you perform your duties. And here he talks even about himself in 322 through 324. He's in 322. He says, "O son of Pritha, there is no work prescribed for me within all the three planetary systems, nor am I in want of anything, nor have I a need to obtain anything, and yet I am engaged in prescribed duties." 323, "For if I ever failed to engage in carefully performing prescribed duties, O Partha, certainly all men would follow my path." And 324, "If I did not perform prescribed duties, all these worlds would be put into ruination. I would be the cause of creating unwanted population, and I would thereby destroy the peace of all living beings." And so then Prabhupada writes in his purport to 323, he says, "In order to keep the balance of social tranquility for progress in spiritual life, there are traditional family usages meant for every civilized man. Although such rules and regulations are for the conditioned souls and not Lord Krishna, because he descended to establish the principles of religion, he followed the prescribed rules. Otherwise, common men would follow in his footsteps, because he is the greatest authority. From the Srimad Bhagavatam, it is understood that Lord Krishna was performing all the religious duties at home and out of home as required of a householder." We see that also in advanced devotional service, that even persons, we saw there were times when Srila Prabhupada showed moments of ecstasy. He choked up, or tears came from his eyes. Even there was a couple places where it came out like syringes, like it describes Chaitanya Mahaprabhu does. But for the most part, he didn't show those things. And that's generally the nature of the advanced souls. They're doing the same thing. They don't want us to imitate ecstasies that we're not qualified for. And that will be the tendency. So if persons who don't really want to follow rules and regulations would rather act whimsically, see advanced people seemingly doing that, not performing their duty, they're going to not perform their duties and do appropriate things, for the wrong motivation. So there's no value in that. So then they commit sinful activities and they're in trouble. So in 325 and 326, he says, "As the ignorant perform their duties with attachment to results, the learned may similarly act, but without attachment, for the sake of leading people on the right path." And 326, so as not to disrupt the minds of ignorant men, attached to the fruitive results of prescribed duties, a learned person should not induce them to stop work. Rather, by working in the spirit of devotion, he should engage them in all sorts of activities for the gradual development of Krishna consciousness. And then Prabhupada has, in his purport to 326, he says, "But because the conditioned souls do not know anything beyond sense gratification, they study the Vedas to that end. But through fruitive activities and sense gratification regulated by the Vedic rituals, one is gradually elevated to Krishna consciousness. Therefore, a realized soul in Krishna consciousness should not disturb others in their activities or understanding, but he should act by showing how the results of all work can be dedicated to the service of Krishna. The learned Krishna-conscious person may act in such a way that the ignorant person working for sense gratification may learn how to act and how to behave. Although the ignorant man is not to be disturbed in his activities, a slightly developed Krishna-conscious person may directly be engaged in the service of the Lord without waiting for the other Vedic formulas. For this fortunate man, there is no need to follow the Vedic rituals, because by direct Krishna consciousness one can have all the results one would otherwise derive from following one's prescribed duties." We're going to discuss that last part a little bit later, where he says they can be disturbed. Don't disturb them, but they can be disturbed. And then in 327, 328, and 329, Krishna says, "The spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by the three modes of material nature. And one who is in knowledge of the absolute truth, O mighty arm, does not engage himself in the senses and sense gratification, knowing well the differences between work and devotion and work for fruitive results. And bewildered by the modes of material nature, the ignorant fully engage themselves in material activities and become attached. But the wise should not unsettle them although these duties are inferior due to the performer's lack of knowledge. And then Prabhupada comes again with a purport that says you can disturb them. He says, men who are ignorant cannot appreciate activities. This is from 329. Men who are ignorant cannot appreciate activities in Krishna consciousness, and therefore Lord Krishna advises us not to disturb them and simply waste valuable time. But the devotees of the Lord are more kind than the Lord because they understand the purpose of the Lord. Consequently, they undertake all kinds of risks, even to the point of approaching ignorant men to try to engage them in the acts of Krishna consciousness, which are absolutely necessary for the human being. So let's talk a little bit about those points. It's disaster for an attached person to ignore the Vedic duties, since they will commit many sins. Right, what's happening with not the karma yoga that we're talking about, where we're not wanting results, but the first thing is there's karma, where people try to perform pious activities to get the results. We talked about them previously, the Veda Vataratahas, those who Prabhupada says don't even understand about liberation, but they think by performing pious activities you'll get desirable things. And so that's the first stage in trying to civilize people. Generally, we just think we should and can do anything we can in order to obtain things desirable and to avoid things undesirable. That's built into people's nature. And we say here, we have the saying in America, right, that nice guys finish last. So do whatever you want. The end justifies the means. Mm-hmm. But that's going to cause all kinds of terrible karma. And so the Vedas offer people a solution. They say, look, if you give up some of your freedom and you follow these rules and regulations, two wonderful things will happen. You'll get more enjoyment than you can get any other way. And you'll also reduce your suffering. You'll avoid all these sinful activities. And so that's really attractive for people. Mm-hmm. And so that's why they take it. Krishna talked about that the warriors, when they die on the battlefield, they go to the heavenly planets. It says the doors of the heavenly planets open wide for them. And so for that reason, they'll do their duty. They'll fight. So you're paid off. It's a reward. So for the reward, you do it. And so if you take away that incentive, well, then they're going to simply return to doing whatever they want to do to get what they want, and that'll be a disaster for them. And then for those who are kind of already trying to give up the results, who are practicing karma yoga, then it's dangerous for them to try to think that they're going to prematurely take up jnana yoga. We already saw what that does to them. They'll be also controlled by their mind and their body and their senses, and God knows what will happen to them. So if they see somebody stopping doing their dharma, they'll be tempted to try the same thing. In both cases, for somebody who's attached and wanting results, it'll be a disaster, and also for the person who's more advanced, actually, and trying to seek for liberation. If they prematurely give up doing those duties, they won't be able to get sufficient purification to advance to the level of jnana, and they'll be in trouble. For those performing their duties, it is an upgrade for them to be less attached to the results, as long as it doesn't remove their motivation to perform them. So it says here, Prabhupada says, they can learn how to give some of the results of their activities to Krishna. Baladev Vidyabhushan says, they can be, convinced of performing their duties without having so much attachment to the result, and that can happen. That can be a good thing as long as they're not so attached that removes their motivation. Right? Somebody who's really attached to the results, that will be hard for them to comprehend how they should do anything else besides keep all the results to themselves. But if it's possible to move them in that direction, that's a big upgrade. And then, but it's proper for anyone to take up bhakti, and this is where Prabhupada was talking about. He said that that the devotees, they understand the purpose of the Lord, and they will take all kinds of risks. Because taking up bhakti is not a risky proposition. Because it has within it the higher taste, which attracts people. Right? We all had that experience. We were persons deeply attached to material things. What attracted us to Krishna consciousness, certainly a good part of it, was we felt something better. We didn't have any purification, likely. We didn't have any great knowledge. We were deeply attached. Most of us were committing so many sinful activities. But we got this, we came into contact with something that was clearly better. And then bhakti also has this intrinsic power to purify the heart. So even though we're not qualified to give up our material desires, Krishna, by starting to perform bhakti, being attracted by that taste, one becomes purified much more quickly than by any other process. So there's no prerequisites for bhakti. For karma yoga, there's a certain prerequisite. One has to be at least intelligent enough to understand theoretically that they're a soul and that liberation is the goal of life. And then one is able to say, okay, I'll perform my duties and not be attached to the results. Otherwise, if we think that material things are the goal of our life, then we want the results. We're going to perform karma to get the results. That's how you get them. But to be, even to do karma, even regular karma, you have to have enough intelligence to do, to be able to defer your gratification. Because if you don't follow the rules and regulations, you may be able to get something enjoyable more quickly. So you have to be able to think, no, this is better. I don't want to suffer as much, and I want something better, so therefore I'll control myself. There has to be still some level of, there's a prerequisite of a certain level of self-control. They do these, funny experiments with children, where they, give them a cookie or something and say, if you can eat it now, or, if you wait for 10 minutes, then you'll get a second one. And people have all these different reactions. Some of them just eat the cookie right now because there it is. Why would you not eat it? Other kids very easily wait the 10 minutes to get the second one. And then there's other ones in the middle who, kind of white knuckle it. They want to eat it now. They want the second cookie. So there's a certain level of self-control necessary for just an ordinary karma. And then a certain level of intelligence where you understand that you're at least theoretically, that you're a soul, and that transcendence is what you want in order to perform the actions without wanting the results. Then it takes a certain realization of being able to experience yourself as soul, to really to gain real control over the senses and the mind. But bhakti has no prerequisites. It attracts you right from the get-go, and the practices create its own qualification, begins to purify you. Okay, so then in text 30 through 35, I guess we'll try to kind of push through these, and then we'll have one section left over at the end, the one about lust, which we'll leave till next week, since we're getting a little along in time here. But in text 30 to 35, Krishna says that we ought to listen to him and follow his instructions, and tells Arjuna that he should stay on his own path, that he shouldn't try. He's trying at the beginning, he's thinking that he's going to become a beggar. That's what he talked about, in the earlier chapters. Better to become a beggar, than to participate in the battle. So here he says, he gives further instructions in 3:30. Mai sarvani karmani sanyasyadhyatma chetasa nirashir nirmamo bhutva yudyasva vigatajvaraha. Says, therefore, O Arjuna, surrendering all your works unto me, with full knowledge of me, without desires for profit, with no claims to proprietorship, and free from lethargy, fight. So this is my, from all you've heard, you make this connection. This is a conclusion you come to. So to me, all your karmas, sannyas, you surrender them to him. Here it's this is where he has the word for word translation says with full knowledge of the self, but in the translation he says with full knowledge of me. Without desire for profit, without ownership, it says fight without lethargy. Okay, so then in his purport he says, this verse clearly indicates the purpose of Bhagavad Gita. The Lord instructs that one has to become fully Krishna conscious to discharge duties as if in military discipline. Such an injunction may make things a little difficult. Nevertheless, duties must be carried out with dependence on Krishna because that is the constitutional position of the living entity. The living entity cannot be happy independent of the cooperation of the Supreme Lord because the eternal constitutional position of the living entity is to become subordinate to the desires of the Lord. Okay? So Prabhupada is giving a very bhakti-centered translation and explanation, because that's what's going to be most practical for us, really. And as you notice in the word translation, he writes adhyatma as being with full knowledge of the self, small s, meaning the soul, where in the translation he renders it as with full knowledge of me, so as if it were the capital S. From the yoga ladder perspective, Krishna has added a new layer of bhakti for the jnana yogi, or for the one who has profound knowledge. Full knowledge of the self, lack of proprietorship, and acting without attachment and aversion, the vigatas dwara, that means without feverishness, the dwara means kind of feverish, are indications of the jnani. These are things that they naturally have. We talked about that in the last section of the last chapter. Those persons who are, had that profound knowledge, pragya pratishtita, fixed in the profound knowledge, they have these characteristics. They have experience of the soul. Therefore, they're nirmamo nirahankara, right? That was described, and that they act with attachment and aversion. That those are things that were described as their properties. And so here, for them, he's saying that they should surrender their actions to Krishna. It means also their results. So this is the bhakta, and the difference here is that the bhakta acts directly for Krishna's pleasure, while the jnani surrenders his following of the Vedic duties and the results to Krishna. It's less direct. You see? They understand. May understand that these rules come ultimately from Krishna. The Vedas come from Krishna. They may understand that, but they're not, and so they realize that that will be pleasing to Krishna. But for the devotees that hear the motivation here, when Prabhupada was talking about, is that Krishna wants Arjuna to fight, therefore he's going to fight, because he wants him to fight. With the yoga ladder perspective, it's more that it is his duty, according to the Vedas, to fight. And because Krishna makes the Vedas, Krishna will be happy with that. It's a little bit less direct, where we're saying Krishna wants me to do it, therefore I do it for Krishna. Krishna has made this system of rules and regulations, for civilized life. I follow them, and therefore indirectly that's going to make Krishna happy. So that's a little bit of difference there, but there's some more bhakti entering into the equation here that Krishna is introducing. So those who are advanced now, practicing that karma yoga without desires, and now coming to the realization of the soul, and even though they're still acting, now they're not only just having consciousness in Krishna, but they're surrendering their activities to Him. So as they're acting, they're and the results they're surrendering to Krishna. So they're becoming more Krishna conscious, more Krishna centered as time goes on here, because Krishna is leading them to bhakti. That's his point. So for us, as bhaktas, we should be, we should see if we have those things, Do we understand ourselves as not only just as a soul, but as servants of Krishna? Do we lack proprietorship? Right? Are we acting? Are we doing our duties without attachment and aversion? How much? Right? Sometimes we prefer to do one thing rather than another, or we perform to do a particular activity when it's more convenient or not. And, and are we remembering Krishna in our activities? And are we surrendering the results to Him? So these things are, so even though the yoga ladder guys are a little bit less direct, they have qualities that should be in our bhakti. And if they're not, our bhakti is lacking. So let's see. We'll look at the verses 31 through 35, and we'll comment a little bit, and then I think that'll be it for us. Those persons, this is 31, who execute their duties according to my injunctions, and who follow this teaching faithfully without envy, become free from the bondage of fruitive actions. 32, but those who out of envy disregard these teachings and do not follow them regularly are to be considered bereft of all knowledge, befooled, and ruined in their endeavors for perfection. 33, even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature, for everyone follows the nature he has acquired from the three modes. What can repression accomplish? 34, there are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they are stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. 35, it is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though faultily, than another's duties perfectly. Destruction in the course of performing one's own duty is better than engaging in another's duties, for to follow another's path is dangerous. So here Krishna is giving Arjuna a final warning about his aversion to fighting, which has caused him to come up with a spiritual pretext to avoid the fight. Right? He tells him it is imperative that he work to overcome his attachment and aversion. He also shows why it is foolish to try to take up the duties of a beggar rather than stick to his duties as a warrior. Because this is, people have that certain nature. They act according to their nature. And that's very difficult to do. Prabhupada says to avoid that. So Prabhupada says, one should therefore, this is in his purport to 35, discharge his prescribed duties in full Krishna consciousness rather than those prescribed for others. Materially prescribed duties are duties enjoined according to one's psychophysical condition under the spell of the modes of material nature. So when Krishna tells Arjuna that even as a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature, right, then he needs to act according to the rules and regulations for that particular nature. That's what's going to act on him. As a warrior, you see, he has certain rules. He fights at a certain time, and he can't fight in other circumstances, and he has to fight in a certain way. So when he's faced with this battle of Kurukshetra, he's facing his aversion. And by going through with it, doing what he's supposed to do, he helps to overcome his aversion. And his attachment, and his aversion to fighting, and his attachment for his family. If he takes somebody else's duty, he thinks, because he's so emotional right now, he thinks, I'd rather go and beg. Well, that doesn't help him. Because his actually it says it's completely against the nature of Kshatriyas to beg. They never beg for anything. We talked about how Bhima, earlier on, how Bhima refused to even ask for these lotuses that were owned by Kuvera, but was ready to fight with the yakshas in order to get them, because it's not the proper etiquette for Kshatriyas to ask anything, ask permission. That's not part of their nature. And so if Arjuna tries to go and live as a beggar, once this emotional, state that he's in because of fear of the battle is over, and once he's being insulted by people for being a coward, his normal nature is going to come out. And he will have, neglected his duty. He won't be able to persist as a beggar, even though he might be able to do it well for a short period of time. So Krishna says you have to you perform the duties that are going to actually free you from the weaknesses that are inherent in your personality. And he says you should not come under the control of attachment and aversion. So this is, you're fleeing from that instead of confronting it. You're letting the aversion and the attachment control you. So you need to do your duties so you can overcome those things. If you try to do somebody else's duties, they're going to remain in place, and you won't be able to persist in those new duties. So that's his kind of final summary of why he shouldn't do what he was proposing at the beginning of the chapter.